Coming up as the NFL playoffs roll on, we take a look at the New York Football Giants and two key fifth-year option decisions, as well as whether or not there are any friendly faces to keep an eye on over the weekend. We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends, it is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your host. I am only Adam Armbrecht, no Andrew Makowitz for this one. We heard maybe coming down with a little bit of something in the middle of the week, so we press on, obviously, without him. We're going to talk about the NFL playoff picture. There are a lot of quarterbacks. We've been doing this throughout the course of the season, and we'll talk about it again next week as well, trying to build a QB room that makes sense for the New York Football Giants. Already starting to also get some buzz just as the heads up around the draft picks and where some of these QBs are projected to go. We've already heard about Jackson Dart now maybe being worth keeping an eye on. Andy and I have another interesting name who had transferred from Ohio State over the course of his college career. That could be something to think about in the middle rounds, right? When we look over at New England and we see Joe Milton, it's a minuscule sample size, but already relatively to where he was drafted and to some of the things he flashed in those limited reps this season, you start to hear a little bit of buzz about what could make sense or what could be options. So we'll get into some of these QBs that we can watch for over the course of this weekend. But first and foremost, as we continue to take a little bit of a look at the offseason, for the Giants and decisions that they're going to need to make, we're getting into the fifth-year option mode. And while certainly we get to Evan Neal, it's going to be a somewhat laughable discussion once we talk about what that number looks like right now, I think. But it still does have ties to Joe Schoen, the decision-making process, and where maybe this team is going to be from a cap standpoint as you project out to another year later and where the figures are going to land. So it's funny. We start with Kayvon Thibodeaux because he won, whether or not we have the debate about how productive he's been, whether or not he was worthy of that fifth overall pick. When you get inside the numbers, it's kind of hard to sit here and say that not picking up the fifth-year option should be a realistic option. And it doesn't mean that I think that he's necessarily the long-term future and he's going to be a lifer like Michael Strahan or some of the greats of the past for the New York Football Giants. But there's just a reality to this, at least in my mind, and I'll walk through it. But before we do, we think about what has Kayvon Thibodeaux done to this point in his NFL career. Now, there have been some injuries for him. One of the things that we mentioned at the time of his draft is not that we thought it was bad, not that he wouldn't be a quality player, but when you think about getting pressure up front, sometimes having guys that are more built on speed, more built on their finesse, and less on their power, it can make things a little bit trickier. However, since coming into the league in 2022 with the New York Football Giants, he started by playing 14 games. He had just 4 sacks that first year, 2 forced fumbles in that rookie campaign. Now in 2023, full 17 game boat, gave you the 24 assists, the 26 solos, the 50 total tackles, the 11.5 sacks, the 3 forced fumbles. Everything felt pretty darn good in terms of him taking that next step forward. He also set 7.5 stuffs credited to him from 4 going back to his rookie year. Then you get to 2024. Now, on the one hand, you can just look and say the injuries alone that play a factor here because you only end up playing in 12 games. So 14 solo, 14 assists, just 5.5 sacks, just 1 forced fumble, 7 stuffs credited to him here as well. And then, by the way, because it is noteworthy to bring up every stat category that matters here, he also had 5, 4, and then 2 pass deflections over his rookie campaign going through year number 3. Did he take the year 3 leap forward that we anticipated? No. Did we see him take advantage of having the Giants go out and trade for Brian Burns in the offseason and turn the attention that he was going to get defensively into an incredible value for him? No, we did not. Now, we already talked about Shane Bowen. He's going to be back in the defensive role. We understand that Bobby Okereke seemingly felt like he disappeared relative to how prominent a figure he was in the year prior under Wink Martindale. So system matters and the way that he got treated. But again, go look at Brian Burns. When you trade for him and he plays the full 17 games, he primarily has never missed more than 2 games in a given season in his career, although 2020, that might be pre-17 game season. I think that is. So he's only missed 1 game in any given year. He shows up, gives you 71 total tackles. That was a career high, 42 solo, career high, 29 assists, career high, 8.5 sacks. That's going to be second highest in his career, only to 2022 with Carolina, where he had 12.5. Gives you 2 forced fumbles, the 13.5 stuffs, and 8 pass deflections. It was all there for Brian Burns, the exact same thing that you anticipate. And whether or not we'll debate about where the dollar amount is going to go and if that was the best decision for the Giants this past offseason, given where the season finished, given how the defensive unit performed, that's a different topic. Bottom line is Brian Burns walked in the door and performed to expectations, and that was supposed to be a seismic value to Kayvon Thibodeaux, yet we didn't see him start to turn over and dominate. Okay, fine. So all of this is, it sounds like I'm saying, what, maybe don't pick up the 5th-year option. But here's the difference, right? And there's also a good article over on NFL.com. This was from Mark Ross, who went through and basically said the 5th-year options and where you want to pick these up. So I won't tell you about Kayvon Thibodeaux and Evan Neal just yet, but I will walk through the fact that there were 10 players out of the first round that he labeled as no's in terms of picking up the 5th-year option. There was one ineligible, which is actually the last pick of the draft, because you had, I want to make sure I almost forgot his name here. Yes, Lewis Seen, who was originally drafted by Minnesota but got released and then was picked up by the Philadelphia Eagles, makes him ineligible for it. Now, there's a handful of mixed bag at the back end of the first round, though there are still players like George Karlaftis. He gets labeled as a yes, obviously. You have a handful of no's like Devontae Wyatt from Green Bay, like Cole Strange for the New England Patriots. Devin Lloyd is a yes, 27th. Jermaine Johnson for the Jets is a yes at 26. A yes for Linderbaum, obviously, who will be playing this weekend for the Baltimore Ravens. A yes for Tyler Smith and the Dallas Cowboys. And this is all working through the mid to late 20s here. And there's other players across the board. First and foremost, inside of the top 14, there's only one player that we will talk about who received a no in terms of picking up the 5th-year option. And that, of course, is Evan Neal. And there's very obvious reasons for that. The interesting part is that you can go all the way out to, say, the 20th pick here, because 21st is McDuffie with the Kansas City Chiefs, and they put him down for a yes. But inside the top 20, Kenny Pickett, drafted by the Pittsburgh Steelers, now the Philadelphia Eagles, no, picking up his 5th-year option. Offensive tackle Penning for the Saints, no, picking up his 5th-year option. Treylon Burks, wide receiver for the Titans, no, to pick up his 5th-year option. A yes on Zion Johnson, the offensive guard for the Chargers, and then a no for Jahan Dotson, who started with the Washington Commanders, now plays for the Philadelphia Eagles, and will be on the field this weekend. Then you get to 15, which is Green, tackle for the Houston Texans, also a team that'll be in action this weekend. But because he had the torn labrum, suffered another shoulder injury in 2024, there's been problems with him just being healthy and on the field. And on top of which, when we look at him, you talk about 327 pass blocking snaps. Green allowed 6 sacks and 37 QB pressures, and pure next-gen stats gives him the second highest mark on the team in sack rate of 1.8% and the highest in pressure rate, 11.3%. So there's potential there. And by the way, just to be clear, he labels it as, I could see Houston moving in another direction. Why would that be a factor, even all the way back to the 15th? Well, when we first talk about Kayvon Thibodeaux, it's about the dollar amount. And we know that there's been a shift in terms of 5th-year options now. It's now categorized into 4 tiers that are going to dictate where you go. Used to be top 10 players of the position, average that number out, and that's what the 5th year was. You now have the basic, you have the playtime rate, you have the 1 Pro Bowl rate, and then you have the more than 1 Pro Bowl rate. If you're wondering, before we get into the numbers on Kayvon, you only have 3 players in that draft class that qualify for the more than 1 Pro Bowl rate. It's going to be Sauce Gardner for the Jets, picked 4th overall, obviously. It's going to be Kyle Hamilton, a guy that we debated back then, but the second that he was drafted by the Ravens, you thought, obviously, he's going to be a massive hit. And then you get Tyler Linderbaum. Guess what? Also with the Baltimore Ravens. So those are the only 3 players that have been in multiple Pro Bowls coming out of this as we look at their 5th-year option. So where does Kayvon Thibodeaux sit in all of this, and why do I think that there's value in going out and pursuing his number? Let's get into that here in 1 second as we talk about not only him, the other players in this draft class that qualify within the same position on the defensive side of the football, and where the top players of the position are currently being paid as we walk into the 2025 offseason. We'll do that here in just one moment. All right, so As we take a look at Kayvon Thibodeaux, where does he stand? First and foremost, in the fifth-year option category, picked fifth overall. He's beyond the basic. He qualifies for the play time. It's $16 million. Now, fifth-year option for $16 million, whether or not, as you're paying someone like Brian Burns significant money as you work your way forward, is that a consideration here? Of course it is, right? Go look at Brian Burns' contract right now and where the Giants may be in a couple of seasons, all the way out into the 2028 year. The base salary is 21 and a half, but the cap hit is going to be 32.5 million. Now, do I think that there's a world where restructuring that money is going to be a thing for the Giants and for Brian Burns? Yes, I do, right? Guaranteed salary only plays itself out through 2026 at 10.75 million. As I mentioned, 21.5 million in 27 and 28 individually. The prorated signing bonus is 7 million. You have the regular roster bonus at 2.5 million, per game bonus at 1 million. So there's a lot of things built into it. But ultimately, if you fast forward and you're in that fifth-year option for Kayvon Thibodeaux, and you're sitting here and you're saying, well, between those two players, we're going to be tied up into roughly $47 million. That's a lot. That's a lot of money. 50 million in those two players is a lot. If they're productive, it's all good. So that's the first part of it, right? You know you're going to be tying up a lot into it. But the reality is, inside of this draft class, you're going to have Travon Walker taken first overall. He's on the play time, fifth-year option, 16 million as well, same as Kayvon Thibodeaux. Aiden Hutchinson, he gets the Pro Bowl bump, $22.6 million. We'll see him on the field. We'll see his team on the field this weekend. Obviously, the injury this year has been brutal for him. You go your way through here in terms of other players, and I'll add in a couple of the defensive guys just for frame of reference, right? Interior defensive lineman at the tackle position, Eagles, Jordan Davis, he'll be playing. He's going to get the 11.4. It's just the basic level for him. You go down a little bit further, and you can find yourself looking at linebackers like Quay Walker, taken 22nd. Again, not an edge rusher, but he gets the same 16 million on the playtime bump as well. Edge rusher Jermaine Johnson for the Jets, he's going to get 14.7 million on his fifth-year option. Basic line for him. Jaguars linebacker 16 million, Devin Lloyd. Packers, this was one that they talked about whether or not they'd be picking up that fifth-year option. If we're thinking back to where the NFL projections went for this, I think they had him down for a no. I'm going to go ahead and just double check on that. Oh no, Green Bay Packers, they had him down for a yes. Okay, you're going to be a little bouncing back and forth here when we think about these. 13 million. That's just the basic package as well. And then you get to the edge rusher in Karlaftis, for the Chiefs, also be in action this weekend. He's going to get the playtime bump, 14.575 million. And why do I bring up all these guys? I mean, all of these guys, and most of them are yeses here when we think about where they're going to project to go. Well, if you combine that with then looking at the position and saying you can go out right now, Nick Bosa and Hines Allen, Brian Burns is up there when we talk about the average annual salary, 34, 28, 28, 25 for Myles Garrett. You've got players like Max Crosby making 23.5 million, Bradley Chubb making 22 million, all the way down. If you think about the players that are going to be coming up here with their own fifth-year options, some players that are going to get signed this offseason, that $16 million number is probably going to fall because you're all the way down to, what do we got here? 4, 8, 12, 16, 18. Yeah, 20. I'm down to 20 players just after Hassan Reddick, getting down all the way to Eric Armstead with the Jaguars, making 14.5 million. 14.5 million and above, and you're already into the 20s in terms of pure edge rushers. Not even getting to linebacker money, defensive tackles, and just the way you want to build your defense and how you want to allocate your funds. So as these other guys pick up their fifth-year options picked up, as a couple more players get paid, Kayvon Thibodeaux at 16 million going into that fifth year after this upcoming season, that's not, to me, going to be prohibitive. And if anything, while we may look back and think, is Kayvon Thibodeaux, was he ultimately the right pick, right? Well, second contracts really matter. If you're getting a second contract, then it was right. So all these guys are getting their fifth-year option picked up. For the most part, you reasonably think the fifth-year option gets picked up because it means you're also going to be negotiating that next contract for him. I don't know what the long-term future is for Kayvon Thibodeaux. But what I do know is that when you go and look, that you're going to have him in the upcoming season on a base salary of 1.1, 4.9 prorated, 5 million prorated signing bonus, a 3.8 million roster bonus, and the guaranteed salary of just 5 million. So the cap number is under 10 this upcoming year. To take And a reasonable bump to 16 million, that's all very negotiable. And the last thing on this, because we're not going to spend a ton of time on Evan Neal for obvious reasons, the last part of this is, even though I'm saying picking up the fifth-year option makes sense for the Giants for Kayvon Thibodeaux, it doesn't preclude them from making different decisions. One of the reasons I think that you do pick up the fifth-year option is because he is a productive player. Whether or not we will look back and say he was worth the fifth overall pick, that's a different conversation. But if I have him under control on that fifth-year option and going through next season, maybe things don't go so well. Maybe the Giants aren't winning a ton of games. Do you consider the idea of fielding offers when you're heading into the next year's draft class if you don't go get your quarterback this season, this draft upcoming here for Big Blue? Then I want to have more draft capital, right? I want to have more assets. So there's always going to be that option. Getting more team control locked in can benefit you no matter which direction you choose to go. And even in the world, though we will talk about it quite negatively, were he to play through his fifth year and not end up getting another contract with the New York Football Giants, you can still walk down that path in terms of what it means about compensatory picks and where he goes in free agency and all that good stuff. That would be a disaster, as we always talk about. How does it relate back to Joe Schoen? It'd be a problem. It'd be a real problem for the Giants to sit there and say, you took two players in the top 10, as we're about to talk about Neal, and obviously Neal is not going to be this renaissance player that we thought he was going to when they drafted him, or that he's even going to turn around and become a decent player for the Giants. There's, again, a specific reason why it's not going to be the case. But if you missed on 5 and 7, and you got retained here, as we know, going into your fourth year by ownership and the vote of confidence, even if this past draft class was good for the Giants, there's going to be problems. I mean, the track record is there. But that's another conversation in terms of second contract for Thibodeaux for another day. For the short term, I pick up the fifth-year option. 16 million is nothing to worry about. I'm not going to be bothered by it. It's a movable figure if you wanted to down the road. And worst case scenario, you're at the negotiation table. You're talking about what a next contract looks like, and we go from there, right? Because 2 years from now as well, you're also talking about where is Brian Burns going to be in his career? What decisions might they make there? And ultimately, fingers crossed, knock on wood, rub your lucky rabbit foot. We hope the Giants are a competitive football team. This upcoming year, maybe a little bit. The following year, certainly, right? And going forward. But it's been so long that even with that playoff victory they had a few seasons ago, it still feels like this team is so far away from really having a core that you can rely on consistently and that you look at and say, we're going to pay you. The other guy, before we talk about the playoffs here, because there's a lot that I do want to get to in regards to this weekend's games. The spreads are pretty big. I might be taking a handful of underdogs, if I'm being honest, or at least taking the points, is obviously Evan Neal. This one's a little more cut and dry because when you talk about fifth-year options, Evan Neal is the only player in the top 14 that receives a no. That's a problem. There's only, again, 10 players in the draft that right now, as of today, in projecting them, Mark Ross says will not receive the fifth-year option. But 9 of them, and 10 if you want to include the ineligible at the back end of the draft, was seen. But 10 of them are players that are from 15 and below. Like, that is a problem for the New York Football Giants. And we're having a real conversation about Kayvon Thibodeaux and what his future looks like. A lot of these guys, for the most part, it's easy to pick up that fifth-year option, right? They're going to be going to their agents and saying, yeah, they're going to pick up the fifth-year option, but let's start having the contract negotiations. To sit here and have Evan Neal be as disappointing as he has been is obviously a problem. And as was written up here, hasn't played more than 13 games in any of his 3 pro seasons, failing to reach double-digit appearances in each of the past 2, and he's allowed 19 and a half sacks and a concerning, I like the word concerning, 128 pressures in 29 career games per next-gen stats. The right tackle has shown little signs of improvement and has even reverted to backup status in 2024. The Giants likely won't exercise the fifth-year option, continue to retool the offensive line in the future. That's its own problem and its own judgment on Joe Schoen. The other part of this is we did see, I want to make sure that I reference this here. I had these numbers up in terms, how is Brasillo done with the offensive line? We'll talk more about this going through the offseason, obviously. But when we look back here, I want to make sure if I can find these numbers. He dreams, he hopes, he thinks he can, but he isn't 100% sure. Oh, dream within a dream. He had performed well is the bottom line, since I can't get these up in front of me right now at the moment. Evan Neal did show progression. John Michael Schmitz did show progression. I think they even listed it wasn't Van Roten, one other offensive lineman that did show improvement in terms of, did Brasillo come in and help the offensive line get better? He did. They did. Okay, fine. It doesn't mean, however, though, that just because you showed some of this improvement and there's a chance that they're going to move him over to guard in the upcoming season, that's only going to open up a bigger can of worms as far as why didn't you make that move this past offseason? Why didn't you start to get him reps there? Why did you choose to sign the players that you did? Some worked out, some didn't. But when you ended up not being able to run a player like Evan Neal, as we all would have suspected, out there at the right tackle to start the year. And then you go and you say, well, if we're not going to be able to run Neal, where are we on our offensive line? And again, there were some bright spots. I think it was decent. We don't sit here and say that it was incredible. But when you look at the depth chart, as we did coming into the year, and then we kind of kept touching back to it as things progressed, to have Jermaine Illuminor end up playing out at right tackle and to have to shuffle things as Andrew Thomas went down. But you brought in players like Aaron Stinney, who we liked and we think it's fine. A young player like Kubis, who we want to see develop. But when you have players like Greg Van Roten, who have to play a little bit of guard, then have to kick inside when John Michael Schmitz goes down with another injury bug situation, the totality, of the offensive line, including having Izudu, who I think gets unfairly judged because why would you have him out there at tackle to begin with? But you're playing all of these guys all over the place. So even though we may have liked Illuminor, we may have liked the John Runyon Jr. signing a little bit at the time, but it turned out that he was kind of average to slightly below average and ends up on IR to end the year. The decisions and the choices seemed okay in the moment, but they did not pan out the way you wanted them to. So even though you may look at Evan Neal and say, I thought he played a little bit better when he was given some chances, there was some real alarming film, obviously, some continued ugly snaps for him where he's getting absolutely beat around the edge, and kicking him into guard may have been an option, but it feels like that road is way too far along. I've even seen reports, which we'll talk about at some point, oh, was he a trade candidate this offseason? If a team wants to maybe have a conversation about getting a look at him, kicking him inside, and seeing if there's some value there. Maybe. I say maybe in massive quotations. It wouldn't get anything for the Giants in return, obviously. But the other part that you can mention here too is, what if the Giants cut him? Well, the dead money would be $7.8 million. He's only on the books in 2025 for $7.8 million. So are you just going to eat that number? And we can go post June 1 here as well. The number doesn't change, right? So the dead money is going to be the dead money no matter what they do with him. And that fifth-year option is not going to be an option because as we stand, it is a massive $17.4 million on the basic. Not going to happen. Not going to happen by a long shot. We wish it was Tyler Linderbaum, who's going to get paid $25 million on his fifth-year option because that's how good he's been. That's how good of a draft pick the Baltimore Ravens gotten him. And by the way, in terms of other players we mentioned across that offensive line, I already said there earlier, Trevor Penning was a no. A lot of offensive linemen, right? Zion Johnson was a yes. Kenyon Green, was a no. So there's a lot of offensive linemen that came out of this. Cross was a yes on the play time for the Seattle Seahawks, but a lot of these guys were no's in the offensive line. That's concerning just from a draft standpoint and how you continue to build out the offensive line. It's why you saw free agency spending from the New York Football Giants. So Kayvon Thibodeaux, yes, I think the fifth-year option get picked up. I don't think it signals anything about his long-term future. Evan Neal, no way you could possibly do it. And a real conversation about what they do with him this offseason is going to happen. Frankly, only because Joe Schoen drafted him is he still a part of this organization at this point of his career. That does it for big decisions when it comes to big money. We'll talk about that all season long. Let's get into the playoff weekend here. Where are the spreads? Do we think there's anything surprising? And what about the QBs that we'll see take the field? We'll do that here in just one moment. All right. Wildcard weekend was by and large disappointing. I think we could all agree. It was, there's a lot of disappointing games, a lot of blowouts, right? Even ones that were surprising in terms of the Texans beating the Chargers in upset fashion. You still, at least for me, took the step back and said, yeah, that was crazy. But because of how horribly Justin Herbert played in that game, 32-12 wasn't fun. The Ravens-Steelers game wasn't fun. The Bills-Broncos game wasn't fun, right? So AFC was not enjoyable in any sense of it. Now, I know that it's the same difference. We talk about the Rams 27-9 over the Vikings. It feels a little bit different only because Sam Darnold is not Justin Herbert in terms of stature right now, I think. So there's bigger connotations around, is he good enough? Sam Darnold, I didn't have expectations. So maybe I low-key thought the Rams were going to win that game, right? The Commanders over the Bucks, that was the only fun one, really, right? Because even the Eagles-Packers game did not play out the way we thought, where there's going to be some more interesting battles. And so we find ourselves coming into it here, where we're going to be talking about the divisional round. Number 1 seed, Kansas City Chiefs. As of right now, laying 8 to the Texans. I think that number has moved, though, even a little bit higher. It might be up to 9 or even, I think 9, maybe even 9.5. But they're going to be going at 4:30 on Saturday. And that game doesn't really hold much from a Giants standpoint in terms of the QB rooms, anybody that we should be interested in. I know that when you go and look at the depth chart for both these teams, there is a name that people have brought up when it comes to the Kansas City Chiefs. On the Texans side, listen, should Davis Mills be a conversation for the New York Football Giants to acquire a player like that? He's not. I'm sure I have this correct. He's not going to be a free agent in this offseason, although I'll double check that. But players like that, when you have CJ Stroud, it's not the same thing when you go into an offseason and you think, hey, we know we have our franchise guy. We know we need a veteran backup somewhere along the way, but we can go ahead and take a look at that and fill that position in any number of different ways. Now, Davis Mills has been around that organization. So there's clearly a reason to want him to be around. But I don't see there being a world where, well, first of all, where he's going to get released, and second of all, where you're going to talk about him being a trade target. You're not going to go get him per se if you're the Giants. I don't think. Although it's an interesting name at least to consider here. Houston Texans' other backup in case Keenum will be a free agent. No, I don't think the New York Football Giants are going to have an interest in him. Okay, fine. And Davis Mills, just as a matter of clarification, is only 26 years old. Like, he did play 2 seasons, 13 and 15 games in 21 and 22. His completion percentage dropped significantly in his second season from almost 67 down to 61%. He was a big interception turnover guy, 10 in his rookie year, 15 in his second season. Rating was 78.8 his second year, 35 QBR, and it dropped from his rookie to his sophomore campaign. So there's a reason why it kind of cooled off on him. I don't know. Maybe I'm actually doing this the wrong way around, right? He's entering his 4th year. Oh, that is his 4th year. So maybe Davis Mills should be on the radar for the Giants. We'll talk more about that coming out of this weekend. That might be an interesting low-level kind of, hey, why not take a little peek at a player that, while you would never think he's going to jump and turn into your franchise quarterback, could he be a nice little bridge option to put into the room? Oh, I would do that in a heartbeat. And just checking on his contract right now, because I want to make sure that I confirm this. He's under contract in 2025. It's a 3.6. It's a $5 million cap hit. There's no reason for Houston to give him up or to walk away from him. What would it take? Is it really worth that much? Yeah, I don't know. You get into the middle rounds of the draft. Do you think about a 5th round pick, for Davis Mills, if you think you could have him for a couple of years and be your bridge guy and then be a nice backup for you? I don't know. Interesting. I didn't even think that I would have that conversation about Davis Mills, and yet here we are. That's a tradable. That's a guy you got to go trade for, and not something you would jump at. Kansas City Chiefs wise, here's another guy that I'm not going to jump at, and that's their backup, and that's obviously going to be former New York Eagle, former Philadelphia Eagle in Carson Wentz. There's just no world where I see this being something that's an option for the New York Football Giants. I cannot see it. There's no, I don't understand it anyway. Mostly because everything you know about him is that he is not a player's player. He has a hard time getting along with people. And by the way, he's bounced from since 2020 when he left Philadelphia, was out of Philadelphia, traded for by Indy, played 1 season as their starter, then to Washington, then to LA, then to Kansas City. This is not somebody at 32 years old that I am remotely interested in. This game to me is interesting. Kansas City, is a grind out team this year. They are not the high powered offensive team that they were over the last handful of seasons. Do I dare take Houston to get the upset on the road? No, probably not. And right now, the percentages tell you that it's a 37.3% chance for the Houston Texans to win this game. But would I take the points? I mean, 8-point spread is a lot, man. You're sitting there and if you can get it at 9, if you buy up to that point, if you're doing a little bit of bet and you want to buy the extra point, 31-23. Like, is that so hard to envision? 27-17. That's concerning, right? But 27-20. Yeah, I can see, because the defense is that good for Houston, that they can keep them in this game. That Kansas City is not an explosive, hey, we're just going to hit you with one big home run shot, done and dusted. How this game script goes is going to be interesting. And from what I hear, Mixon right now is at least questionable. If he's not going to be able to go for Houston, that's going to change it. But how many possessions do we see in this game is going to be interesting, certainly. So I'm going to tentatively take Houston and the points. I am not going to touch them winning outright, obviously. Other games on the schedule here when we talk about the weekend, AFC, obviously I mentioned there the 4:30 slot. Later that night on Saturday, we're going to talk about sorry, it's going to be Sunday, so we'll flip it over here. The other Saturday game is going to be the Lions hosting the Commanders. This is a hard one for me because it's laying 9.5 Detroit to the Commanders. I don't mind that number either. This does make my second underdog team that if I'm taking the points, I feel pretty good about it. The 9.5 is nice. You want to tease it up to 10. I think you're really in a sweet spot because, again, it's 34-24, or it's 34-20, and maybe, Washington is down and they get the late touchdown. They cut it down to into single digits. Yeah, I can see that being the case here as well. There's not nearly as exciting on the Commanders side when we talk about where their roster is in the QB position. There's other free agents that we'll discuss as we move along. It's Marcus Mariota. I think we made mention of him last week when we were doing our first pass at some of the quarterbacks, but I just don't like Marcus Mariota. Not as a person. I don't have an interest in him being a part of the Giants QB room, looking for a veteran to bring in. Where do we stand? I do not have an interest or anything inside that goes, oh, that would be something to look into. The interesting one in this is on the other side when we think about Detroit, and obviously you have Jared Goff there. It's why people are kind of maybe pulling for. Obviously, the Detroit Lions have been a good team already, but the idea that Detroit could win, that the Rams could upset the Eagles, and we could be having the conversation about Matthew Stafford against Jared Goff, the two teams that traded these players for one another, that by all measures has worked out for both sides in that case. But I have a hard time around this narrative that people have talked about Hendon Hooker being an interesting one for the Giants to consider and going out and trying to acquire him. Not because I have anything against him. We talked about him. He's 27 years old. He is a player that certainly has some pedigree to him, but he's thrown 9 passes. So I didn't think that he was a guy that you necessarily would want to draft, depending on where you could take him. He ended up going in the 3rd round, which I would have said is too high. If I can cast my mind back, maybe I would have thought, 4th round, 5th round could be an option because he was older coming out. This is where I have a hard time when ownership is saying we want to win, our patience is low. Hendon Hooker is a little bit of a risk. We'll talk about him on a deeper level. What was he coming out and what do we think he can be? But I don't have any sample size really here. And same thing about Joe Milton, by the way. Everyone getting overhyped about him. You still haven't seen a ton from him, right? So you're looking back to the preseason games in some regards. I don't know. I find it interesting. I find price point interesting when you talk about that. But he certainly is another name that at a minimum you can consider. Flip it down over to the other two here. I know we're going to run a little bit long, but the QBs are, do matter here to me. When it comes to the Bills game, another one here. This is Bills at home. This is a -1, by the way, for Baltimore on the road. Supposed to be snowy, supposed to be cold. I don't know who it favors more. The Ravens are the less imposing, maybe defense. I think a lot of points are going to score in this game no matter what. People are saying that it's going to be another MVP season for Lamar Jackson. I think I'm taking Baltimore on the road, and that's hard. It's hard because I like both these quarterbacks. I like Josh Allen. I like Lamar Jackson. I want them both to succeed, and that's the hard part about watching these guys in the playoffs and watching them take on Patrick Mahomes in AFC championship games. You want to see them break through, right? So that's the tricky part for me. It's Josh Johnson backing up the Baltimore Ravens. Let me go ahead and just break the news to you. I'm not going to be looking at him as an option for the Giants this offseason. And on the flip side of it for Buffalo, we're talking about Trubisky, also not going to be an option. I'm not talking about whether free agents or otherwise. I'm just saying these guys are neither are players that I'm terribly interested in exploring when it comes to it. I will take I think I'm taking Baltimore in this game. I will acknowledge that. So as it stands right now, Texans in the points. I think Kansas City wins. I'll take the Ravens outright to win that game. I would even, yes, lay the 1 point. I'm going to take the Commanders, probably plus the points. Again, maybe tease it up to 10 if you want. I think that can be a good game, though. This is a young team. It's Jaden Daniels. Detroit has been phenomenal. So there is a little bit of get kicked in the mouth kind of opportunity here. And then the Rams Eagles. So we already talked about whether or not the dream is dead with Matthew Stafford because they won and whether you think you could trade for him. That's Andy's dream. It was my dream first, but then Andy bogarted it. I don't know. I don't know how losing to the Eagles would impact their long-term decisions. I brought up Jimmy Garoppolo, and I know people may look at it and say, "Oh, Jesus God, do we really want to look at Jimmy G?" Listen, he's played a lot of football over the years, right? Now, he's had injuries and like that. He only has really 2 full seasons in 2019 and 2021 with San Francisco, and then he gets sat down in 2022. So I get it. But he has 82 starts under his belt. He's a 67% completion percentage. And in the instances when he's played, now again, this past year with the Rams, it's only one game, 27-41, 66%, 2 touchdowns, 1 pick. Not bad, right? The year prior with Las Vegas, where everybody looks worse than maybe what they really are, 1,200 yards, 7 up, 9 down. The interceptions, the turnovers have always kind of lingered there for him. Dude, but he's 96 up, 52 down, touchdowns to interceptions, right? Like, he's a 97.6 rating. He has 48 in his pocket in terms of QBR, 56 going back a few years in San Francisco. I'm not here, screaming about how amazing he is, but I am sitting here telling you that's a real option that I think will be discussed if you're building out a complete QB room. So Jimmy Garoppolo is interesting to me, especially if you're the Rams. I think that's a very, fungible position there behind Matthew Stafford. And likewise, they have Stetson Bennett as well behind him there, whether or not that matters. But he was a draft pick for them in 2023, so they can very much transition. And they've done this now. Baker Mayfield came through a year. He moves on, right? So you see them kind of rotate through some of these backups. I don't think that they're concerned about who's in behind them. So options on the table in that game. This one's really hard for me, mostly because it's the Eagles, and you always want to root against them. The fact that the Eagles have one of the better offensive and defensive lines, that I don't think it's going to look the way it did the week prior when the Rams really got after Sam Darnold. It'll ask questions of Jalen Hurts. The weather could be a factor in this one as well. I find it fascinating. I think it really just comes down to, can the Rams, who are not a high-powered offense, and we're in a high-powered offense against the Vikings despite putting up 27 points, can that run game dictate tempo a little bit, right? Can those short passes to Puka Nacua, can that get somewhere for you? Cooper Kupp had a nice game. Can you utilize your weapons effectively? I think time of possession in this game is fascinating. This is minus 6.5 for the Eagles. Hard for me to totally wrap my head around if I would take the Rams and the points in this instance, or if I think that some of what's gone on here with the Eagles is everybody in Sirianni and talking S because they're kind of a mess. Guess what? This is like MVP season for Saquon Barkley, right? Like, this team is good. This team is really good. And I think maybe because there was some of that internal, issues or concerns, it made it feel like, well, they'd be easy to say upset city, right? But we said this going back when the Giants played the Vikings. Don't think that they were as good as their record maybe said because of Sam Darnold. No knock on him. Don't think the Vikings were as good as their record said this year either. So getting beaten by a very experienced team in the LA Rams and that coaching staff and that quarterback tandem, I get it. Like, I understand why they end up losing that game. But it's going to be a toss-up here. This is a really hard one for me to pick. Really hard one for me to pick. I'm taking the Commanders and the points. I'm taking the Ravens laying it. I'm taking the Ravens to win. I think the Lions will win. I think the Chiefs will win, but kind of the same with the Eagles. Different because there's so much pedigree and so much winning with Kansas City. But people have said all year, Kansas City, they're just not that, they're not the same. And then here they are, right? Number 1 seed. And part of me does like the idea of seeing Kansas City in the AFC Championship. Hopefully it is the Ravens, even if it is the Bills, and someone that, 2 teams that have been trying to get there, getting over the Kansas City hump. You would like to see that. So from a narrative standpoint, I think it's really good. And again, I am pulling for that Rams-Lions matchup in the NFC as well. So give me the Rams and the points. They do have a good chance, I think, take that game outright. Early game script really matters here for them. Get behind. Philadelphia can pin back, do some things defensively. They got the secondary. Quinyon Mitchell, by the way, who's phenomenal, who I liked, and the Giants. It's always players. It's always players you can look and say, should have been, could have been. Why wasn't it us? Jaden Daniels, by the way. Why wasn't it us? Could have moved heaven and earth to go get him if you wanted to. Nevertheless, that'll be the way I look at it. It hopefully is going to be a fun slate of games. I do think that. I think that even though the Texans and the Commanders are susceptible to get blown out here, I'm optimistic that all four of these games are going to be fun, interesting, engaging, at least into the fourth quarters. Maybe a touchdown pulls it away, makes it two-score games, but I like the idea that Washington can go offensively, potentially, toe-to-toe with the Lions for a while. Houston's a different story. I think about their defense and what they're capable of, and obviously health is going to be a factor here too. My God, guys, enjoy it though, man. There's nothing to worry about for the Giants. We're not on the field. We talk about a few quarterbacks that could be potentially in play. I think Garoppolo is an interesting one. I think Hendon Hooker is worth discussing, obviously. Those are the most viable options coming out of these four games here. So let's talk about, right? You think about how can the Giants build it out? How can the Giants find a way to create a more interesting, exciting QB room that's capable of maybe winning some football games and also capable of coaching up and developing a young player if they choose to draft one? I don't know if Drew Lock's the right guy to have in that room to help coach up a young player. Having Tommy DeVito might not be bad because he's been there. He's been in the system, but he's not going to tell a young rookie player something that based on pedigree and skill set and talent and expectations, that rookie and that this fan base isn't going to look and say, yeah, he'll figure it out. I don't know if Tommy needs to get his hands too dirty here, right? So we'll look at all those narratives. Enjoy the weekend slate. We'll come back in on Monday. We'll break down everything that we saw over the weekend, and then we'll extend these conversations about QBs. Andy and I will go head to head. Who do we think would make sense for the Giants? How can we look at that room and say, let's be under 20 million for the year, potentially, if we're thinking about constructing a, piecemeal room and still feel kind of confident about what they're capable of doing. And we'll get into some of these draft picks because the QB class is starting to take shape and you're starting to hear that pre-combine buzz where there's two or three quarterbacks. Oh, they're a third, they're a fourth, day three. Now all of a sudden you're already hearing the rumors. Watch out. They're going to rise fast. Okay. Let's see if they're capable of doing it. Until next time though, guys. Whew, what a journey. Get us over on YouTube at One Giant Podcast. Get us on your podcast feed at One Giant Podcast. Leave your comments about it. We've already seen this a little bit over on YouTube. Get in there and let us know who are some of the quarterbacks, backup wise, not the elite players, not the trading for Matthew Staffords, but who are some of these backup quarterbacks that you would like to see, regardless of what goes on in the draft, as a veteran quarterback under center for the Giants to start the year, a nice tone setter, someone that maybe feels like is better and gives you a better set of expectations than Drew Lock after the Giants jettisoned Daniel Jones this past season. Let's build it better. Get us in there with your comments, and you can include a Davis Mills if you want to, and trade targets, Hendon Hooker, and trading for a quarterback if you think the price point is right. We'll continue that discussion on Monday. Getting over on X at Adam Armbrecht, at One Giant Podcast, and at AMAC214. Until the next time, until the best times. If he was here, as Andrew Mackowitz would want, need, and demand the people know, as always, let's go Big Blue.